afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan, and today we are going to be talking about mandatory minimum sentences in Oregon. So for more than 25 years, Oregon has been using a measure known as the one strike, you're out law. And this law has passed down harsh sentences that have filled prisons and fueled mass incarceration and racial disparities in mass incarceration. Under Oregon's Measure 11, which voters first passed in 1994, anyone 15 years or older faces a mandatory minimum sentence of between 5 and 15 years for crimes like robbery, arson, kidnapping, assault, and murder. And because these sentences are mandatory, judges are not able to consider a whole host of factors that should potentially result in a reduction of sentences. So they can't consider things like history of trauma and abuse, which, by the way, is pretty common for people who are sentenced, who are both children and women. And they're not allowed to consider things like brain development, which if you are 15, 16, 17, 18 is something that should be considered because studies show that our brains have not fully developed until the age of 25. But judges can't consider any of these things. And in fact, once a person is convicted and sentenced under Measure 11, there's not even a chance for them to be able to be granted leniency once they're behind bars. They cannot apply for parole, regardless of their conduct behind bars, regardless of if they've rehabilitated themselves. And so each year in Oregon, prosecutors issue over 2,000 indictments under the one strike, you're out law. And studies show that Black men are hit with these indictments at deeply disproportionate rates. According to some estimates, as many as half of all people currently incarcerated in Oregon prisons are serving mandatory sentences under Measure 11. Now, in recent years, lawmakers have been exploring changes to Measure 11, and these changes would restore judges' discretion. A bill currently before the state's legislature proposes changing mandatory minimums to presumptive sentences for offenses other than murder, which basically means that judges can do their job. They can consider the whole factor of circumstances while still using these guidelines to guide their decision making. Now, this proposal has triggered opposition from Oregon's District Attorneys Association, which maintains that the law is necessary to protect communities from the most extreme crimes. But not all district attorneys in Oregon agree. And luckily, we are joined by two of them today who do not agree. Joining me now are Multnomah County DA Mike Schmidt and Deschutes County DA John Hummel, who have both come out publicly in favor of reforming Measure 11. Thank you both so much for joining us here today. Very excited to have this conversation with you both.
Lana, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I want to start by asking you your perspective on Measure 11 as prosecutors. So what is it, who does it apply to, and how does this one strike you're out rule impact your ability to do your job? So DA Schmidt, I'll start with you on this question.
This is an important conversation. I come at this from a little different perspective. Before I took over as district attorney in Multnomah County, I was the head of the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission, which is a small state agency that looks at data and research into what works. And I was privileged to travel across our country and internationally. I got to go to Norway and see their prison system and how they step people back down through and into society with their focus being on rehabilitation. Mandatory sentencing, the focus is not rehabilitation. The focus is punishment. And I think that's problematic. It actually sets us up for decreased public safety in our community when people are released. Because when they're serving mandatory sentences, they have no incentive to do treatment, to work on classes, to not act out and moderate their behavior in prison. And then they know what their date of release is, and then they get released. So I think that we should be focused more on how do we get people back into society, rehabilitated with the best opportunities for success. And in that way, I think Measure 11 misses the mark.
DA Hummel, I want to get you in here. The Portland area is a very different place than Bend and Deschutes County, where you are. So what has been the impact of Measure 11 there?
Well, the voters in Deschutes County elected me to keep them as safe as possible. I take that obligation extremely seriously. My team and I, we review every case and we ask ourselves, what is the intervention that we can apply in this case that will maximize the odds that this suspect will not reoffend again? And by identifying that intervention and advocating for it in any individual case, that maximizes community safety. That's what we should all want, right? But we can't do that in Measure 11 sentences because the sentence is already decided by virtue of the charge. And I've seen countless times, hundreds of times in my career as a public defender and as a prosecutor, where a judge, after considering all the evidence, would say either, I think this sentence is too harsh. I'd like to, send this, young offender to, mental health treatment and drug and alcohol treatment. They don't need, 9 years in prison. I've also heard judges say, this sentence isn't tough enough. I'd like to give a longer prison sentence, but Measure 11 won't allow me to do it. It is ridiculous to say that we're going to have judges in a robe sitting on the bench, and whatever a defense attorney says, whatever a victim of crime says, whatever I say, whatever a probation officer says is irrelevant to sentencing. The judge has to take out the rubber stamp, drop it down, and impose the sentence that someone 20 years previously decided was best for this case. It doesn't work, it doesn't keep us safer, and it needs to be changed.
So you both have honed in on this idea that this sort of sentencing, mandatory sentencing, doesn't keep people safe. And we've also seen how mass incarceration is a crisis across the country. But when most people think about this crisis, they think about the Deep South, Alabama, Texas, Louisiana, etc. But there's also this crisis in Oregon, and it's been called a red justice in a blue state. And people are spending decades or their lives incarcerated. So when you both talk about public safety, talk to our viewers about how much Measure 11 has contributed to mass incarceration in Oregon and why repealing it would make Oregon not just a fairer place, but also a safer place. And on this one, I will start with you, Schmidt.
Yeah, thanks. I think that looking at all the things that we talked about, when you look at when the law was passed in the mid-90s and we were in that tough on crime era, the idea was that incapacitation was what would keep us safe. Well, we've done decades of research since then, and we know not only is that not true, that that's not a causal relationship between safety, but we can actually make us less safe by people not doing the things that they need to do to work on themselves. When this law was passed in 1994, since then, the Oregon prison population has almost tripled. And we now rank about 25th in the nation in terms of our rate of incarceration. So we're average. Oregon is the average for incarceration in the United States, which, as we all know, is a complete outlier in the world in terms of how much incarceration we use. So this is absolutely an issue in Oregon, and that means that we're taking resources to work on, to build prisons, to hold people incarcerated, and that's using up a lot of our resources we could use on education, healthcare, treatment, addiction treatment, victim services. So there are so many better things that we could do that I think would get better public safety outcomes than just a model of punitive incapacitation. And the other way it's made our communities less safe is it's hollowed them out, especially, and as you noted, the disparity of who we see who is in our prison system. Entire communities, especially our Black communities, have been disproportionately hit hard by these sentencing laws. So we're taking away people who can earn and support families and support community, and taking them out of the game. So it's also hollowed out our communities. All of those things lead to making us less safe and spending a lot of money when we know that we could be spending it in better ways to really improve public safety.
DA Hummel, what are your thoughts? How do you think Measure 11 would make your jurisdiction and all of Oregon, more fair and safe?
Well, Alana, we know what improves community safety. It takes work, though, and people like the quick fix. We need to improve Oregon's abysmal high school graduation rate. We need a higher percentage of kids reading at grade level by third grade. We know that's one of the biggest predictors of success of children. We need to, reduce the poverty rate in Oregon. There's too many Oregon kids going to bed hungry at night. We need to work on Oregon's houseless problem. We need to reduce that. We need to, fix our transportation infrastructure to better enable kids and families to, get to school and work. We know what reduces crime, and we know what doesn't reduce crime. Increasing prison sentences does not reduce crime. My colleagues in the District Attorneys Association who support Measure 11 will say, in a very simplistic fashion, well, we've implemented in Oregon Measure 11 in 1995, and since then, crime has gone down. So Measure 11 must have been the cause of that. But we know that's not how you determine whether something's actually working. We look to the data, right? And we see across the country, crime has been reduced in states that have mandatory minimum sentences and in states that do not. We've seen studies where states have reduced their mandatory prison sentences and crime has continued to decrease. So we know increasing prison sentences does not reduce crime, and we know what does reduce crime. I'd love it if my colleagues would come together on a poverty initiative or come together on an education initiative. I would hope we could all agree on that, but it's hard and people don't like the hard work.
So let's talk about some of the opposition to this, because you hinted at it a little bit. I want to talk about the Oregon District Attorneys Association and how they have responded to your concerns. It seems like the ODAA and other critics are saying that by ending this practice, that Oregon will be a less safe place to live. So what is your response to that argument? And DA Hummel, I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, I don't want that. I mean, I was elected to keep our community as safe as possible, right? But here's how I do it. I get involved in my community and we build, collaborative efforts with, the social service agencies to reduce crime. What I've done, working with our community, developing diversions out of the criminal justice system into the medical system for people with mental health issues and addiction to drug issues. We've reduced crime in Deschutes County 16% during my 7 years in office. 16%. That it far exceeds the statewide crime reduction rate. So I would say to my colleagues who support Measure 11, I would say, what have you done to reduce crime in your community, right? So I think they believe it in their heart. I don't think they think if we that Measure 11 is not responsible for crime reduction, right? I think they believe it in their core because they were brought up in the system, right? They've been, career prosecutors, and it's just kind of a truism that you're told. And so if getting rid of it would make our community less safe, I don't think, I'd be, signing up for it, but I know that it will make us safer if we focus our efforts on what actually reduces crime. And so, but my colleagues do have this just belief that you need to hang on to Measure 11 to keep us safe. The data doesn't bear that out.
So I want to stay here on the Oregon District Attorneys Association for a moment, because for a very long time in Oregon, as in other states across the country, the Prosecutor Association opposed so many criminal legal reforms while at the same time championing policies that really fueled mass incarceration. Now, both of you are affirmatively supporting the repeal of Measure 11. And this is a position that's contrary to ODAA. And we see similar trends happening in Virginia and California, for example, where prosecutors are championing criminal legal reform, including by testifying at the legislature against express positions of their state prosecutors, or their state prosecutors association, rather. So I'm wondering if you think this shift is important for the ability to pass significant legislative reform in states like Oregon. And this one I'll start with DA Schmidt.
Yeah, I think that, we're right now working collaboratively, trying to with the Oregon District Attorneys Association, but they know that we disagree on this issue. and that presents challenges. But John and myself and another district attorney from Wasco County have kind of joined forces and put our seals out there to put our position forward. And so that's what we're trying to do, is to advance the best policies. But it absolutely is. It's a challenge. And by the very nature of the Oregon District Attorneys Association, and probably just about every district attorneys association around the country, just the way that you see the kind of politics play out, where you have more progressive DAs tending to be in more urban areas, although that's not completely true, as we see here even in Oregon. But generally, then you have organizations where district attorneys represent each county in a state. And so when you look at even our national political maps, you can see this issue, where in the more rural areas, you see more conservative district attorneys generally, and they have the votes. And so in the Oregon District Attorneys Association, you have 36 elected district attorneys. And on this issue, 33 of them seem to be against the repealing Measure 11. But then if you added up the actual population of my county, of John's county, of Matt Ellis's county, we have about a third of the state. So you have that kind of challenging dichotomy where just by the structure of these associations, I think they're kind of built to be regressive. And so, we're working within that structure. And I'll say we have our challenges, but we also get to have good conversations. And a lot of people have encouraged me to stay within the organization to try to have them hear a voice internally advocating these positions. And I see benefits to that, but there are challenges.
So, DA Schmidt, I also know that, and you mentioned this a bit earlier, that you've spent time in your previous career as the head of Oregon's Criminal Justice Commission. And during that time, you spent a lot of time immersed in the data on crime rates and sentencing. And last week, the commission put out a report on sentencing trends around Measure 11's application in Oregon. So talk to us about what that data says about the effect of repealing Measure 11 on both safety and equality.
Yeah, well, the report really kind of confirmed the things that we already know. So the Criminal Justice Commission first looked at this issue in 2011. And so they just put out a report. It's almost like a decade later reviewing the same thing. And so what did they find? They found that we see a lot of first-time offenders being sentenced due to Measure 11. They estimate somewhere up around 70% of the people that end up getting sentenced because of a Measure 11 charge having no prior felony criminal history. So like you said, it confirms that this is a one strike, you're out type law. We've talked a lot about racial disparity, and we look at who is in our prison system. And in Oregon, we have a lot of disparity in terms of the percentage of people who are Black that are serving prison in a very white state. But then what the Criminal Justice Commission did is they actually looked at it charge by charge, and they allow us to kind of unpack some of that data. And what we saw was that for certain charges, that if you're Black, you're more likely to end up with a prison offer, a prison sentence, than if you're white for the same crime. So not just saying, more Black people in prison, but when we look at it crime by crime, we could see disparities upwards of 10% more likely for Black people to end up in a prison sentence and then a white person who gets a probation sentence. So, they've really kind of done a good job of unpacking a lot of the things that we knew. And then when it comes to public safety, they just call out what DA Hummel already has, that there is not a causal relationship between prosecutors having sentencing discretion in reducing crime versus whether or not judges had discretion to sentence. There's no causal relationship there. There's no research that they can point to that keeps us any more safe.
So I have another data question coming up, and this time, DA Hummel, it's going to be for you. So the Oregonian has an article out today that features new polling out this week from Data for Progress in the Lab. And the lab is a project of the appeal. And this data found that, or this polling found that more than 62% of Oregon voters support passage of pending legislation to reform Measure 11, while 61% of Oregon voters agreed that the measure should be repealed. So, DA, are you surprised by these results? Do you think ODAA is being responsive to public opinion when it comes to their approach to Measure 11 and other criminal legal reform issues?
Well, I'm not surprised by these results. I mean, it's kind of, I like where we've come as a society, that people in the criminal justice profession are comfortable speaking up now against these mandatory minimums. I did it 7 years ago when it was maybe a little uncomfortable to do it, but I'd have conversations in my community, which is not like Portland, right? We're east of the mountains. We are 7 years ago. We were more conservative than we are now, but we are purple now. We are not a blue community. And when I talk to my rural constituents in Lapine, Oregon, about Measure 11, what I tell them is, hey, if someone does something awful, and they've done it repeatedly, and they've been given chances to get help for their addiction or help for their mental health issues, I might be tough on that person. And if some young kid comes in here with no prior record and does something because he's under the influence of drugs, and he's never had help with his addiction, he's never had a good parental supervision in his life, he's never had anyone give a hand out to him, I might try to get that kid the help they need, because if I help that kid, one, I'm helping that kid, I'm helping his family, I'm helping any kid he might have in the future, but I'm also helping our community, because it's going to be less likely that that kid reoffends. So there's going to be less victims in our community. And, if you vote for me, that's going to be the type of DA I'm going to be. And what, thankfully for me, a majority of them have said is, that's right by me. That works for me. So it's not, I'm not an abolitionist on jail or prison. There's a place for prison in Deschutes County, but that place is for people who we've tried every option short of prison, and we fail. I tell my deputies, when we get a long prison sentence on a case here, we won't be high-fiving, we won't be celebrating. It's a sad day in our office, but we've done it because we felt there was no other option to keep our community safe. So we seek those sentences in rare cases when it's necessary for community safety. And we also are proud when we seek sentences where we avoid a prison term for a suspect, because we believe that makes our community safer, and we're doing right by that person's future. And so Oregonians, when you explain it to them, they get it. What they've had for 20 years is the shrill sound bites that say, if you get rid of Measure 11, there's going to be rapists running down the street. So that Mike and myself and Matt Ellis in Wasco County are having these conversations now. It doesn't surprise me that Oregonians' opinions on it are changing. And it's not just the three of us who are doing it, right? We're having this national conversation about it too. So it's good to see Oregonians are moving on this.
So I want to shift gears and very briefly touch on another issue in the criminal legal system that your Attorney General, Ellen Rosenblum, has also described as a stain on the criminal legal system. And that is until recently, Oregon allowed convictions by non-unanimous jury decisions, meaning that people could be found guilty even if some jurors thought that they were innocent. And although the Supreme Court has found this unconstitutional, that decision wasn't made retroactive, meaning that there are still people who have spent 5, 10, 30 years in prison based on split jury decisions where some jurors didn't think they should go to prison at all. And so in New Orleans, DA Jason Williams said that in those sentences, or that people who are in on those sentences, that they should be retried. So question for each of you, and I'll start with you, DA Schmidt. Do you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I agree with our Attorney General Rosenblum that this is a stain on Oregon's history. And looking at people who have served those sentences and been convicted for a non-unanimous jury, I think that we should relook at those and revisit those and recognize either we need to retry those cases and see whether or not they could be convicted unanimously, or we should consider all of the other factors that we'll take into account, such as what the victim's thoughts are, the time that they've already served, what the necessity of public safety is to keeping somebody in. And so that's what we're doing when cases come back to us, and we're able to look at those things. But some cases we're not able to. We're not able to revisit because of the appellate posture they're not in at this moment. And so actually DA Hummel and I and some others have been working on legislation that would help us fix that, which would allow sentences for resentencing, allow a prosecutor and a defense attorney to bring a sentence back to a judge and ask them to resentence. That's something that we've seen in other states like California, and we actually copied the legislation from Washington State, but in a few other places too. So that would be another tool in our tool belt to right some of the past issues in our criminal legal system.
DA Hummel, what about you? Do you think people who are sentenced under this mechanism should be retried, resentenced? What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. It is a stain on our justice system. I heard when we were having this debate, a few years ago, and people, would say to me, yeah, Hummel, maybe you're right. Maybe non-unanimous jury verdicts, maybe that's not the way to go. But if we were to change it, we'd have this big problem of retroactivity, and it would create chaos in the criminal justice system. Well, what I said to them is actions have consequences. If you're going to pass a racist law, don't come to me and say, if we undo that racist law, that's going to, cause some bad things to happen. Maintaining that racist law was causing bad things to happen on the daily. So what I said was, it's wrong. We need to get rid of it. I was saying that, for 7 years, and thank goodness that, law professor Eliza Kaplan at Lewis and Clark Law School, she made this her mission. Her and her students got this issue to the forefront, got it in the media, and was doing amicus briefs and pushed this issue. I give her credit, for getting this over the hump. And so right now, the appellate courts in Oregon are looking at cases on a case-by-case basis. And so absolutely, some are being retried. There's about 14 in Deschutes County right now that have been sent back to me, and we'll retry it if we think that's appropriate. In some cases, we are dismissing if I think that's appropriate. It's a case-by-case analysis. A problem we have is the records on these cases are not good in some cases on whether the jury verdict from years back was unanimous or not. We have records in some cases, but in many cases, the court documents just say guilty or not guilty. So we don't know if it was unanimous or not. And those, we can't retry them again because it may have been a valid conviction. But on the ones where it's clear that it was non-unanimous, then yes, so there's an opportunity for retrial, and I'm seeking those.
Seems like it was a system that was so fundamentally flawed that it's going to take a good amount of work to correct it, but you're right, it's absolutely the work that needs to be done when a racist system has been in place for so many years.
Yes.
So thank you so much for joining us and for all of the work that you do. This conversation has been wonderful, and thank you again.
Alana, you're welcome. Happy to come on anytime.
Thanks, Alana.
So for more than 25 years, Oregon's harsh system of mandatory minimum sentencing has fueled state prisons, fueled racial disparities and mass incarceration. And as we've heard from both DAs today, has not kept people safe. And so now the state legislature is in a place to correct the harm that it has caused, to reform Measure 11, also known as the One Strike You're Out law, and to return discretion to judges so that they can do their job, so that they can consider a whole slew of factors that should be taken into consideration when deciding whether or not to deprive someone of their liberty for several years. And the idea behind this change is pretty simple. We shouldn't have laws that just automatically put people in cages for decades without thinking about whether or not that actually makes sense. And some of the data we've heard today here is is quite alarming. I mean, we've heard that there's a significant number of people who are in prisons right now on first-time offenses under Measure 11, meaning they've done something once that we don't know the full circumstances, the full factors, and are automatically punished, deprived of their liberty. And as we've heard DA Hummel say today, that doesn't contribute to public safety, because when you incarcerate someone on a first-time offense for a significant period of time, when circumstances make it so that there are all these sorts of things that contributed to that crime, you actually reduce public safety because you hurt the other people in their lives, and you make it more likely so that somebody who this was their first offense is going to reoffend because of the trauma they face while they are incarcerated. And Oregon voters seem to agree with this, according to recent polling. But that hasn't stopped the Oregon District Attorneys Association from opposing these changes. But our guests today are some of the few prosecutors who are standing up in favor of reforming Measure 11 and returning sentencing discretion to judges. As they noted, none of this would prevent judges from handing down severe sentences. All it would do is give them the opportunity to decide that such sentences actually fit the crime. And also would do a lot of work to repair the generational harm that this has caused and the racial disparities that this has caused. I mean, we also heard DA Schmidt tell us that certain charges, if you are Black, you are more likely to serve prison time for them than if you are white. So repealing Measure 11 is not only smarter, better for public safety, but it also corrects the racial injustice that has been occurring in the criminal legal system in Oregon for over 25 years. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us here today on The Appeal Live. I'm Alana Sivan. You can continue to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Until then, we'll see you next time.